Welcome to this lecture organized by the International Association for the Study of Arabia in association with the MBI Al-Jaber Foundation and the British Yemeni Society on the transformation of the Imamate of Yemen, 1200 to 1800 by Ekaterina Pukhovaia. She holds a BA, MA in Oriental Studies from the Lomonosov Moscow State University in Russia and a PhD in Near Eastern Studies from Princeton University. She's currently working on her first book, Between Sultans and Imams, State and Elite Transformation in Zaydi Yemen, 1200 to 1800. Ekaterina has been a Polonsky Fellow at the Leer Jerusalem Institute since October 2021. Kate, we're very much looking forward to your lecture, so over to you.
Thank you for this introduction. I am grateful to the British Yemeni Society, the International Association for the Study of Arabia, and the MBI Al-Jaber Foundation for organizing this event. I am particularly grateful to Noel Berhoni for inviting me to give this talk. Thank you so much. I would like to start with a dedication to the many Yemeni Zaydi scholars, researchers, archivists, and librarians who continue their efforts to preserve the Yemeni manuscript heritage through preservation and digitization initiatives. The research underlying this talk would not have been possible were it not for their work. I would like to particularly highlight the efforts of the Imam Zaydi Ibn Ali Foundation, as well as two American-based projects, the Yemeni Manuscript Digitization Initiative and the Zaydi Manuscript Tradition Project housed at the Institute for Advanced Studies. Today's talk concerns the transformation of the state in Yemen over a period of 6 centuries. Before we delve into that, a few premises should be discussed. So what is meant by the state in Yemen in this time? We of course know that there were a variety of polities formed in both the upper and lower Yemen over the course of history. This talk, however, focuses on the Zaydi Imamate in the region. The Zaydis were a Shia sect who first arrived in the northern highlands of Yemen at the turn of the 10th century in 897 and formed the Imamate around the city of Saada. What is important to note here as our first premise is the influence of Zaydism as a political ideology on the formation of polities in the region. Zaydism is centered around the idea that the leader of the community should be an imam. An imam had to be a member of the family of the prophet, a descendant of the prophet, that is a sayyid, and had to meet certain other requirements, such as being male, being fully bodied, being mentally capable, and to be a recognizable scholar. Zaydism, in this view, put a lot of weight onto meritocracy and open up the field of competition for the position of imam to many sayyids, while not creating any foundations for dynastic transfer of power. This made transfer of power in any state that was formed by the Zaydis a weak spot. The second premise that we should consider is the competition that the sayyids faced as they arrived into Yemen. When they came into the region, the area was already under control of tribal groups that had been there for many centuries. Because sayyids arrive into tribal territory, they spend a lot of time asserting their power in the region. And this becomes, again, a crucial point for the development of the Zaydi state. However, the sayyids had a solution for this issue, and they put forward the group known as the ulama, or scholars, to serve as arbiters between the competing elites of the sayyids and the tribes. The scholars, as we've already mentioned, were an important idea in Zaydism, as they were empowered to recognize the scholarship of the imam who was presenting his candidature for leadership. Because the scholars could have come both from Sayyid and tribal background, they became a kind of a meeting point between these two competing groups and arbiters, both between them and between candidates for the imamate. Okay. Finally, one last premise that we should keep in mind for this talk is the importance of competition for the development of the Zaydi state with southern Yemeni polities in the lowlands that were often Sunni, as well as with other Islamic Muslim groups in the region, most notable about them, the Ismailis. The 6 centuries that we will talk about today can be roughly broken down into 3 periods. The period of the classical Zaydi Imamate from the 13th to the 16th century, the period of Ottoman conquest that I will refer to in this talk as the Ottoman century, and a post-Ottoman period of Zaydi political development, predominantly characterized by the Qasimid Imamate, so we will speak of it as the Qasimid period. I have just mentioned that the Zaydis first arrived in Yemen in the 10th century, and one would ask why I don't start in this period. The answer to that is that in the first 3 centuries of its existence, the Zaydi polity was very weak. Precisely this competition with the tribes that I spoke about earlier made it very hard for the Sayyids to develop a durable political system. This, however, changed at the turn of the 12th century. The reasons for that were multiple, but most notable here would be that the start of this period that we can define as the classical Zaydi Imamate can be associated with the figure of Imam al-Mansur Abdallah ibn Hamza, who came to power in 1197 in a process that is known as Zaydism as da'wah, or calling to power. What was the political landscape in which he rose, and why did he create such a powerful state? The reasons for that, notably, was the arrival of the main thing that prompted the development of the Zaydi polity in the time was the arrival of the Ayyubids, a new dynasty in the southern Yemeni regions. The Ayyubids brought with them a new administrative system, a new shape of the army, and all of this exerted a great pressure on the Zaydi political system in the Northern Highlands, prompting it to develop further. In his attempts to build a stronger, more centralized state, Imam al-Mansur Abdallah ibn Hamza faced also internal opposition, most notable among them a group of Zaydis known as the Mutarrifiyya. The Mutarrifiyya are interesting because they thought that Zaydi identity, unlike what we've described earlier in the premises, didn't actually require an imam to be developed. Of course, to an imam who wanted to build a strong state, this kind of political group was a serious opposition, and much of Imam al-Mansur Abdallah ibn Hamza's rule was dedicated to overcoming this opposition. One could ask, how can we measure the success of this imam's project? One factor that we can look at is the cultural development that we see in his time. During the rule of Imam al-Mansur Abdallah ibn Hamza, a great number of manuscripts are produced. Many of them are histories, and most notable among them are the biographies of this imam. It was typical for the Zaydi imams to have a biography known as Sira in Yemen to be composed during their rule or shortly thereafter. Imam al-Mansur Abdallah stands out among the many Zaydi imams because he has more than one biography written about him. Moreover, in his time, and you can see an image of on your right, the big image on your right is a page out of one of those biographies written during his lifetime. The image that you see in the center is a published work. This is a chronicle, a history of Yemen, a history of Zaydi political, a Zaydi political history written in the times of Imam al-Mansur Abdallah ibn Hamza by one of the great Zaydi historians, Humayd al-Muhalli, who also in this time composes a unique work, which we know the existence of which we know only from a few copies, which was a first mirror of princes or a collection of advice for a ruler, Nasihat al-Ula. We do not really know of any other works of this genre in the Zaydi historical tradition, and the fact that the first one seems to appear in the time of this imam is indicative. Finally, looking at the last image on the slide, the one below, we also know about this imam that in addition to being a great scholar of big importance to Zaydism, he was also a poet. And this manuscript, an image out of which you see, actually represents a collection of poetry written in his time. The issue with this argument about cultural development being an indicator of the strength of this imam's state is that with the manuscript tradition, we can never really tell what the survival rate of texts actually means. Does it mean that there was more cultural production, or there was more cultural production in previous periods as well, and those texts simply didn't survive? We do not know for sure. However, there is another factor on which we can look at to assess the success of this political project, and that factor is social development, and specifically the transformations within the elite. So what happens in the period of rule of this imam is that because of his efforts to make the imamate a strong institution, it becomes more interesting for a variety of sayyids to compete for it. So we indeed see after the rule of this imam an increased competition between candidates of sayyid descent for the imamate. Not only do they compete between each other, but they also coalesce in groups that identify themselves not just by their descent from the prophet, but by a more concrete family. Some of the notable families that form in this time are the al-Hamza, named after the imam himself, or rather his father, the Banu al-Wazir, about which I will speak in this presentation, and the al-Muayyad. These families formed to really stand out from the crowd. Being part of a family meant that they also developed local geographical bases and developed ways of building up a support base. If we look, for instance, at the al-Hamza, a very partial genealogical tree of which you can see on this slide, the family continued after the time of the imam to build its identity for several centuries. If you look at the bottom of this genealogical tree, all of the names that you see there appear in sources from the Ottoman century and from the Qasimid period. Many of them associate themselves with this figure, Muhammad al-Shawir, who was a later descendant of the imam and was a very strong figure. We will return to him later in the talk. In addition to creating this new family identity, the al-Hamza attempted to place imams into power. And their only real success was this person, Muhammad, the son of the imam, who was given the title of Muhtasib, which means that he was not fully recognized as an imam. People who followed him thought that he was not quite meeting the requirements. Nevertheless, this was the one success that this family had in placing their candidates to the imamate. All other attempts didn't really succeed, and instead they became participants in other families' games for power. The al-Hamza, and this will be relevant for us in the talk, usually resided in the area around Saada and the Jawf, so in the northern and almost northeast territories of the region. Another notable family that develops its identity in this time are the Banu al-Wazir. Again, you see in this slide a very partial genealogical tree that I built. The family was significantly larger. And we know a lot about the Banu al-Wazir because they wrote a history of their own family known as Tarikh Bani al-Wazir. This text was recently published in the US. However, unfortunately, I had not yet seen the edition, so everything I will tell today is based on my manuscript research. The Banu al-Wazir positioned themselves as scholars and statesmen. In their history, they call themselves Ahl al-Ilm and Ahl al-Riyasa, so leaders and scholars. The family developed its identity around the figure of Muhammad ibn Mufaddal al-Hajjaj, the person over here in this genealogical tree. He claimed the imamate. At the same time, he was a contemporary as Imam al-Mansur Abdallah ibn Hamza. However, as time went by, he gave up on his claim and instead took up a position within the administration of this imam that was given the name Wazir, hence the name of the family. The Banu al-Wazir were exceptionally successful at building local alliances and developing their identity, not only as sayyids, but as also sayyids who were interacting with tribes. Their preferred method of building these alliances were marriage. And the result of their development as local rulers can be really seen in one particular figure, Fatima bint Hassan, whose full genealogical tree you actually see in this slide. Fatima lived in the 15th century, and for 30 years, she was the ruler of Saada. How was it possible for a woman to become a local ruler in Yemen in this period? The reason for that was that Fatima was building on two main sources of power. On the one hand, She was a descendant of a great Sayyid family. Not only that, but she was the granddaughter of an imam and a great-granddaughter of an imam. Here are the two names in the genealogical tree. But that was not sufficient. In addition to that, Fatima had very strong tribal connections. Both her grandmother, Fatima bin Sheikh Tahir, and her mother, Kurdiya al-Asadi, were of tribal origin. And this element, this ability of the Banu al-Wazir to build local alliances and to use them to enforce their power is really visible in the case of this exceptional woman. She is truly one of the very few women who are called in Tarikh Bani al-Wazir, women who could have been imams were it not for their gender. I would like now to speak about what we can see as the peak development of the classical Zaydi system. And this is the Sharaf ad-Din Imamate of the 16th century. Imam al-Mutawakkil Yahya Sharaf ad-Din belonged to a side branch of the Banu al-Wazir, and in many ways he met our classical image of a Zaydi Imam. He was the grandson, both on his maternal and paternal line, of two Zaydi Imams. He received a classical education with some of the most notable scholars of his time. He received administrative experience in the administration of one of the Zaydi Imams. And finally, in 1506, in a moment of weakness of the Zaydi Imamate, he called to power. The weakness in question was that the Zaydi Imamate at this time became overwhelmed by the powerful southern dynasty of the Tahirids. And in a fateful development of events, Sana'a, previously under the control of the Banu al-Wazir family, was captured by the Tahirids. So in this moment, Yahya Sharaf ad-Din steps up as a candidate for the Imamate. However, the first 10 years of his rule are not very notable. He is just one of the many players in the region. He is stuck between two powerful enemies, the Tahirids on the south, but in the north, he has another opponent, the Zaydi Imam of the al-Muayyid family, whom we've mentioned earlier. However, if you look at the chronology that I put in the slide, you notice that in 1517, so about 10 years after his call to power, Yahya Sharaf ad-Din does succeed and conquers Sana'a. How was that possible? Luck really struck, he really struck luck. Events entirely beyond his control created a vacuum of power in Yemen. So the period we're looking at is a period of European expansion in the Indian Ocean and Red Sea region. And at the turn of the 16th century, the Ottomans and the Mamluks of Egypt form a coalition to fight off the Portuguese. In an expedition that was totally unrelated to Yemen, at least not to the Yemeni highlands, the Mamluks were traveling to fight the Portuguese in the maritime regions. However, they went on a raid into the Yemen, swept away the Tahirid dynasty, mainly because, unlike the Tahirids, they had access to firearms, and conquered the main urban center, Sana'a. However, the Mamluks who came into Yemen had no plans to become rulers of this territory. They didn't bring with them any administrative apparatus to build up on their conquests. Moreover, in 1517, just as they had achieved control over the region, Cairo had fallen to the Ottomans, and the Mamluks themselves were left leaderless. It is at this moment that Yahya Sharaf ad-Din swept in, conquered Sana'a, and started a period of 2 decades in which he became one of the first Zaydi Imams to unite both Upper and Lower Yemeni territories, extending north all the way up to Saada and Najran, and in the south all the way to Zabid. Yahya Sharaf ad-Din's imamate was an imamate of extraordinary territorial expansion. No previous Zaydi imamate had to deal with such a huge territory to rule. What it meant for the political system was that the administration needed to develop. And we see how Yahya Sharaf ad-Din steps out of the patterns that were set by his ancestors, that is, his reliance on a small group of Sayyids who are his relatives and a small group of tribes that are in alliance with him through marriage, to expand beyond those constraints, specifically to the class of the scholars. So this is a transformation of elite that happens in his time that we can again trace through cultural efflorescence. In his time, very similarly to Imam al-Mansur Abdallah ibn Hamza, several biographies of Imam Yahya Sharaf ad-Din are composed. You can see in this slide to your left the page a page from his biography that was composed at his court by the historian, unfortunately we only know his surname, Al-Ulufi, during his lifetime. It is a day-by-day record of all of the events that were happening at the center of the Imamate, letters that came in, people who came to visit, gift exchanges, what the Imam said, what he did, and so on. Even if you just look at the way this manuscript appears, it is very different from the biography of Imam al-Mansur Abdali ibn Hamza that we saw here earlier. The spacing of the text, the beautiful hand, the use of red ink, all of this indicates a strong chancery influence, a showing off of power, a showing off of prosperity. Yahya Sharaf ad-Din's Imamate was very strong and very rich. However, the transformations that we started talking about created a new pressure for him. If you look at this small image over here of a section of a genealogy of the Sharaf ad-Din family, all of the lines you see over here are names of the sons of the Imam. You can see on this next slide a more detailed genealogy, and even this list over here on your left is not complete. All of these sons of the Imam were members of his administration. He relied on all of them to control it. But what this meant that the question of transfer of power became even more acute. Imam Yahya Sharaf ad-Din foresaw that issue. In the 30s, when his Imamate was at his peak, it looked like he was grooming his elder son, al-Muttahar, the son from his marriage to a woman of tribal descent, a daughter of a sheikh, to become his heir. If we read al-Ulufi's Sira, the one that I showed on the previous slide, we learn that Muttahar was given really big responsibilities as a military leader, as an administrator, but he was also receiving education as a scholar. In short, the Imam was attempting to shape him in an heir. However, during the numerous military campaigns, Muttahar was wounded and became lame. And thus, in the eyes of Yahya Sharaf ad-Din, he became ineligible for the Imamate. In the 40s, this issue became even more visible. The Imam himself started, according to some sources, to lose sight. We already know that he was a very principled person, so the fact that he was losing a physical ability really made him alert to the fact that he needed to solve this issue of transfer of power. He had already discarded his son Muttahar as a possible heir, so instead he picked another son, Ali, the son of this Sayyida, Maryam bint al-Hadi, whom he divorced. That's why she's colored blue on this chart. Ali was significantly younger and less experienced than Muttahar, and Muttahar refused to accept the decision of his father. Moreover, Ali himself, the chosen heir, sided with his elder brother against his father, whereas Shams ad-Din, Muttahar's full brother, also a son of this daughter of a sheikh, sided with his father. For the next 5 years, between 1541 and 1546, the Sharaf ad-Din Imamate was in a deep succession crisis. The two parties were fighting each other, occasionally turning to a new power that was slowly growing in the south, the Ottomans. In 1546, after a prolonged battle, Yahya Sharaf ad-Din finally acceded. He allowed his son Muttahar to take the position of ruler. We will discuss in detail what title exactly Muttahar took at this juncture. However, he also divided his Imamate into dominions for all of his sons. This decision is significant. We will see it again in the Qasimid period. So the Imamate was weakened. Nevertheless, Muttahar was recognized by most Zaydis at the time as the ruler, the head of this state. However, he was not granted the title of Imam, or even of Muhtasib, or deficient Imam. We will find not a single source from his time of rule that indicates that he held this title, except for one, an obituary in a marginal note preserved now in a manuscript in the Turkish libraries. It is probably not a coincidence that such a source is kept outside of Yemen and was composed after Muttahar's death. Contemporary sources, however, speak of Muttahar in several ways. They call him Malik al-Arab, king of the Arabs, al-Malik al-Nasir, the victorious king, or Sheikh al-Arab. You can see images from sources that call him this way over here. So here is al-Malik al-Nasir al-Muttahar, Here is al-Muttahar Malik al-Arab, and here is an Ottoman source that calls him Sheikh al-Arab. Again, this is a unique and significant development for the Zaydi system. For once, the Zaydi ruler was not claiming his legitimacy based on being a Zaydi imam, but was now in another way, appealing to his Arabness, to being the leader of the Arabs, and even, interestingly, in his title al-Malik al-Nasir, referring to the Rasulid tradition. I know that Daniel Verisco is in the audience, and he would be able to attest that many of the Rasulid rulers had some sort of combination of al-Malik and something as their regnal title. The imamate was weakened, and as I mentioned, a new power was coming into play at this time. And that power were the Ottomans. Historiography about the Ottoman conquest of Yemen is quite broad, so I will try not to spend too much time on it and go over it shortly. The Ottomans take a very long time to actually expand into the Northern Highlands. They're initially only really interested in the maritime regions so that they're able to control trade. However, in 1547, shortly after the succession crisis that we just discussed, Özdemir Pasha conquers Sana'a and concludes the first set of agreements with the Zaydi powers of the time, namely with Muttahar. Those agreements seem to have been rather loose in that they formed some sort of hierarchy in relationships between the Ottomans and the Zaydis, however, did not fully integrate the Zaydi highlands into the Ottoman province of Yemen. As the Ottomans started to squabble between themselves, and especially notable here was the division of the Yemeni province of the Ottoman Empire into two governorates that really weakened the Ottoman power in the region, Muttahar was able to rise against them in rebellion. All of these events are very well known, and there is a wonderful English translation of an important source, a contemporary source from the time done by Clive Smith, called Lightning over Yemen. This is a translation of a section of a chronicle by al-Nahrawali, a Hijazi historian, who describes the expedition that the Ottomans sent to reconquer Yemen. The leader of this expedition was Hoja Sinan Pasha. It was a rather complex struggle to achieve that. Nevertheless, at the end of it, the Ottomans develop a new deal with the Zaydis, and we can really speak of the next 50 years of Ottoman presence in the region as a golden age of Ottoman-Zaydi cooperation. The foundations of this cooperation from the Ottoman side involved a very elaborate policy towards elites. They identified the three key social groups within the Zaydi elite and developed specific methods of dealing with all of them. First and foremost, they noticed the existence of great Sayyid families, and they noticed that they had their own claims for control over certain territories, that they wanted to be legitimized and become hereditary, and they granted them those rights. We will speak about an example of such a family shortly after this. But dealing with the Sayyids alone was not enough. By including them in this way into the Ottoman system, the Ottomans eliminated them as potential fighters for the role of Imam. However, they also needed to include other sections of the Zaydi elites. So they turned their attention to the tribal leaders. You can see on the slide a document that really represents what the Ottoman policy toward tribal leaders meant. It meant including them into the administration and giving them administrative responsibility, and through that, political representation. This document is only one of many that shows how sheikhs, leaders of tribes, were basically made responsible for the militias consisting of their own tribes, specifically for the distribution of salaries to them, and then for reporting to the Ottoman government about how those salaries were paid out. This was a significant development, as at no previous time in the Zaydi Imamate, where the tribal leaders used as elements of the administrative system to such an extent. Finally, the Ottomans tried to develop a policy towards the Zaydi scholars. The Zaydi scholars were probably the most conservative group within the Zaydi elite. However, through personal interactions, most probably specifically with their Ottoman counterparts that often had the same education as they, maybe not in precisely the text that they read, however, in the general spirit of learning, the Zaydi scholars slowly became more open to collaborating with the Ottomans and becoming part of the Ottoman system. And by the end of the golden age of Ottoman presence in the Yemen, we see Zaydi scholars serving the Ottomans as muftis, so issuing legal decisions, as overseers of waqfs, and even at the court of Ottoman governors, writing poetry in their honor and the like. One example of really successful Ottoman policy towards elites is the case of the al-Shamsaddins of Kawkabān. The al-Shamsaddins were descendants of that very Shamsaddin, son of Yahya Sharaf ad-Din, who sided with his father against his brother. In the division that came at the end of Yahya Sharaf ad-Din's rule, this son gained control over the fourth city of Kawkabān, located only about 25 kilometers from Sana'a. The manuscript that you see in this slide fully encapsulates the extent to which the al-Shamsaddins were incorporated into the Ottoman system. This manuscript contains a text composed by a member of the Shamsaddin administration, most probably of tribal origin, a scholar called Amir al-Du'ami. And the text itself is a biography of Hassan Pasha, one of the Yemeni governors, styled in many ways as a Zaydi Sira. The manuscript itself was produced in Kawkabān. However, as you can see from the image, actually has traits of an Ottoman work of art, I would even say. Moreover, its trajectory involved moving it out of Kawkabān to Istanbul, possibly as part of the property of this governor once he retired, and eventually it landed in the Leiden University Library Special Collections as part of the Levinus Warner collection, thus being, in a way, probably the earliest Yemeni manuscript in a European collection. What this manuscript shows us is the extent of collaboration between the Ottomans and these Sayyids. From it we learn that Hassan Pasha was in regular contact with members of the al-Shamsaddin, that he negotiated on their behalf with the imperial center to provide them what they sought most, hereditary rights to Kawkabān and the legitimization of them. He visited Kawkabān, he stayed there for long periods, participated in council meetings, and even though he didn't know Arabic well, enjoyed Arabic poetry and paid generously the Arab poets who composed it for him. The extent of his personal contacts with the al-Shamsaddin was so great that when a member of this family passed, he wept, according to al-Du'ami, who was a witness as he delivered the message. This manuscript and the story that it contains is a unique attestation to the extent of Ottoman-Zaydi symbiosis. However, golden ages tend to end. And as the golden age of Ottoman rule in Yemen was coming to a conclusion, it faced a new challenge. The rise of the Qasimid Imamate. Again, the rise of the Qasimids is rather well explored in historiography, so I would like to focus on a couple of episodes here. First, the figure of Imam al-Mansur al-Qasim himself. Unlike the Sayyids that we've discussed previously in this talk, al-Mansur al-Qasim didn't belong to any of the notable families that formed in the 13th century. We actually know not that much. Especially from the sources that are composed in his time about his early days. We do know that initially he was in strong opposition to the Ottomans, but didn't have ambition to become an imam himself. However, as events developed, he realized that there was an opportunity for him to rise against the Ottomans and to form a support group. This support group included Sayyids like himself, who didn't belong to these great Sayyid houses who gained so much from collaborating with the Ottomans, and scholars of tribal descent who, in a very ironic twist of history, became able to become scholars precisely due to the fact that their fathers were included into the Ottoman administration and received salary from them. We have a few personal stories from contemporaries of this imam who tell how their fathers were able to pay for their education precisely because they're parts of the administration. However, despite this success in building a support group, a core support group, Imam al-Mansur Qasim didn't really succeed in pushing the Ottomans out of Yemen. He died in 1620, and it took another 18 years for the Ottomans to fully leave Yemeni soil. The honor of pushing the Ottomans out of Yemen belongs to his son, Al-Muayyid Muhammad. And it is precisely on this transfer of power from father to son that we should focus on in more detail. As we've discussed, transfer of power was always a weak spot in the Zaydi system. And even Yahya Sharaf ad-Din, who could have potentially succeeded in transferring power to his son, made a mess out of it due to his principles. According to sources, al-Mansur Qasim didn't leave any orders on who should become his son. So at the moment he died, a council of his core supporters came together to decide who of the sons of the Imam would become the next ruler. It is significant that they didn't even consider other Sayyids at the time. The pool of candidates consisted only of the sons of the Imam. Most prominent among them was the future Imam al-Muayyad Muhammad, the eldest son of the Imam, who had much respect among the elites of the rising Qasimid Imamate. He had spent about a decade imprisoned in Kawkabān as a result of unfortunate events that happened during the early periods of al-Mansur Qasim's political career. But then eventually he was released, became a very important figure in the military system, an administrator. He had the loyalty of many officers. However, the council was swaying to a different figure. They didn't want to support Muhammad as ruler, and they were considering some of his brothers as alternatives, Hassan, Hussein, and Ahmad. In a personal move, Muhammad left the council and went to rally his supporters among the officers. Their protests outside of the council in the streets were, according to some sources, the event that swayed the decision and made it possible for Muayyad to come to power and to be recognized as Imam. The whole election is an enormous break of tradition from the previous Zaydi political tradition. But what it actually also meant for the developing Qasimid Imamate was that even though Muhammad was able to push his brothers aside to become the ruler, he still had to count with them. And this is an issue that he faced once the Ottomans were pushed out of the country in 1638. With the enemy gone, he had to somehow appease the ambitions of his brothers. So what he did was replicate the decision of Imam Yahya Sharaf ad-Din and divide the Imamate into dominions, assigning each of his brothers a territory that was in fact left in the rule of their descendants. While the rule of the third Imam of the dynasty, al-Mutawakkil Ismail, is seen by many as the golden age of the early Qasimid Imamate due to the geopolitical expansion, the trade connections, the economic development that the region was witnessing. One reason why it was being held together by this figure was that Ismail was the youngest son of the Imam, but generationally at his time, he was the eldest member of the family. So he was dealing with his nephews, but not with his brothers. And he was able to control the Imamate to some extent. And he laid the foundation of a system that carried the Qasimid Imamate for the next couple of centuries. A dynasty was formed. Competition for the Imamate was constrained to members of the family. Despite some attempts by occasional Sayyids from previously notable families, for example, the Shamsuddins, to try to place their figures out as candidates for the Imamate, overall, the competition remained within the Qasimid family. A trade-off for containing this competition was the need to divide the Imamate into some sort of appanages or dominions to appease all of these unsuccessful candidates for the Imam. But the center of the Imamate still needed a way to control what was going on in the appanages. And so they developed a new support group in the figure of the Qadi, the judge. The judges were the only administrators that were appointed by the Imam to all of the dominions controlled by his relatives. Slowly but steadily, the Qadis developed into an almost case-like group, defined more by descent than by their merit or meeting certain requirements to become a judge. To contain the ambitions of Sayyids outside of the Qasimid family, the central power continued to maintain the agreements that were developed by the Ottomans. So Sayyids, for example, of the al-Shamsuddin continued to control Kawkabān, and their hereditary rule was re-established by the Qasimids early on. Finally, another element of the Ottoman system that the Qasimids were forced to keep was the relation with the tribes. They were taking it even further. We find in the sources stories of how a member of a tribe and a Qadi were appointed to hold dual appointments within the administrative system. This was an elaborate policy towards elite that allowed the Qasimid Imamate to survive for the following centuries. So what does this discussion of 6 centuries of state and elite formation in Yemen tell us about the general trends and observable patterns of political development in the region? As we saw, territorial expansion led to pressures on the political and administrative system and sharpened the tension between ideological principles and the necessity to stabilize the regime, specifically in the moment of transfer of power. Secondly, the political and social development went hand in hand, and what it meant that the appearance of a stronger state created a stronger elite group in which competition for positions of power increased. In this situation, as our third conclusion, we can see political systems that were flexible and creative about their alliance building and about developing a support group were able to survive in increasingly complex and difficult situations and conditions. Thus, as a general conclusion, we can see how, despite the complex religious and tribal divisions of the region, political development that we saw today actually shows that for much of its history, Yemen was not a failed state.